Thanks, Russ, for those kind words. And where'd Carrie go? Yeah. Oh, pull it closer, huh? Okay. How's that? Better? So thanks, Russ, for those kind words, and what an honor to honor Carrie, who's been such a friend and help and servant to me, including, I was just thinking about it, I spoke at one of these symposia almost 10 years ago when I was still a arrogant graduate student. I'm an arrogant professor, but hopefully less. So, so thanks to Carrie for taking a chance on a kid whose Wesleyan identity was, under the natural threat that occurs in graduate studies. And it was these kinds of experiences that just kept me so intertwined humanly and personally and intellectually with our tradition. So anyway, thanks, and you'll be missed as we send you off. So I was asked to talk a little bit about ordination from a systematic theology perspective. So here goes. Toward a Wesleyan theology of ordination. What is a Wesleyan theology of ordination, and why does it matter? In this brief talk, I present only a skeleton of an answer to the former, and no more than a suggestive platitude for the latter. But skeletons and platitudes are often more useful and almost always more flexible than fully fleshed out accounts with detailed directives. At least I can hope that they will provoke useful discussion today and beyond. A theology of ordination matters because it articulates why ordination matters. It is sad but true that the most convincing reason we give for ordination is the tax break. We talk about other things, but when when the microphones are off and we're off to the side, like, hey, save on taxes. Now that tax break is a reason, and it is a reason bound up with much deeper reasons regarding the legal status of the church in modern nation states. These are no laughing matters, but they are still extrinsic reasons. They are not yet reasons intrinsic to ordination as a practice of the church. In other words, they are not yet theological reasons. So my suggestive platitude is simply this: a theology of ordination matters because it articulates why ordination matters. If that's something that matters to you and or to those in your care, then perhaps this skeletal sketch will be of some use to you. So now to that sketch. What is a Wesleyan theology of ordination? To structure our reflections, I'd like to attend to each word of that phrase. First, what is ordination? Second, what are the elements of a theology of ordination? And third, what makes a theology of ordination Wesleyan? So, first, what is ordination? Let's first approach this question phenomenologically, just looking at it as a phenomenon. What would a relatively neutral observer notice in the church's act of ordaining some of its members? What does it appear to us to be? How does the church use the word ordination? It seems to me that the word ordination has both a narrower and a wider sense. The narrower sense refers to the public ritual in which a church ceremonially authorizes its ministers. But the wider sense of ordination refers to the whole unfolding process that begins in the selection and preparation of candidates for ordination, passes through the turning point of a public event of ordination, and culminates in the ongoing status of those who are ordained. What unites these three moments into a single movement is authority. Ordination is a process of authorization. Those with authority authorize others to share in their authority. The threefold structure just noted brings this to light. Ordination begins in the discernment of one's fitness for authority. It turns on a public event in which that authority is granted and culminates in a life of exercise of that authority. Interestingly, this threefold structure of ordination as authorization can be perceived even within the narrow sense of ordination as a ritual. So, keeping this threefold structure in mind, let's continue our analysis by paying attention especially to the public act of ordination. So I'm kind of focusing in on just, if you show up at an ordination service, what are you going to see? Not because that's the whole of ordination, but because hidden there is the whole wider structure of ordination. Although I might have just wanted to make it easy for myself by making it smaller. But anyway, I think there's something there. When we observe a ritual of ordination, what do we see? It seems to me that the public act of ordination consists in, first, the recognition of a person fit for authority. Second, the mediation of authority to this person. And third, the anticipation of this person's forthcoming exercise of authority. Recognition, mediation, and anticipation. These three constitute the one act of ordination. So ordination recognizes, mediates, anticipates. Those are the three concepts that I'll be leveraging for the rest of the paper. So just hope that tracks. Recognizing what's there, mediating something new, anticipating what is to come. It's got past, present, future. It's basic structure. Now, I confess that this is all very abstract. I believe these abstractions are vital for unfolding my argument. I also hope they'll be helpful for our ensuing discussion. But let me be more concrete. The public act of ordination consists in at least three distinct yet indissolubly connected aspects: the presentation of candidates, the laying on of hands, and a prayer. So first, ordination is an act of recognition. In the ritual of ordination, the church recognizes persons who have been selected and prepared as fit for ministry. We're kind of camping out in this category when we start talking about the competencies and the preparation, right? We're kind of talking about the recognition side. This occurs in what we may call the presentation of candidates. Whether formalized or not, this inevitably occurs. Ordination services are almost never just an open-ended altar call. Who'd like to get ordained? Hop on up. I said almost never. These things do happen, but for the most part, right? For the most part, ordination operates with a clear presentation of those who have, prior to the act, been selected by the church and prepared through some sort of mentoring, education, etc. And so the selection and preparation of ordinands precedes the act of ordination. Furthermore, this prior process is not simply assumed, but in fact is gestured towards in the public presentation of the ordinands. Notice the way we literally set them aside. Think of an ordination service, right? It's in the simple things, the way they might march in, or seated separately, or brought up in front in some way. It's implicit in the act, whether formalized in a ritual or not, whether we call it the presentation of candidates or not. There's always this way of somehow signaling, okay, these are the people we're kind of focused on today. My shorthand for this is recognition. The presentation of candidates for ordination recognizes an authority that's already in some sense there. They've already been implicitly authorized because we said we're getting ready to ordain these people. So we're going to set them aside. They've already been authorized in some way. In the presentation of candidates, the act of ordination is an act of recognition, recognizing them. But ordination not only recognizes fitness for authority, but also mediates that very authority. This finds its core symbolic expression in the laying on of hands. Those who are authorized to authorize others gather around the candidate, place their hands upon him or her, and in doing so, not only recognize an authority that's already there, but also and primarily mediate an authority that is being given in that moment. However one thinks this through theologically, at least on the surface, the act of ordination presents itself as conferring some sort of authority that was in some sense not yet there. No matter how much training, experience you're bringing in, we've recognized that, but something's happening in some sense here, at least on the surface. The laying on of hands strikingly symbolizes this mediation of authority as it's being passed from those already authorized, those who have had this happen to them before, to the one being authorized in that very moment, the handing on. So in the laying on of hands, the act of ordination is an act of mediation. Okay. 3. Ordination is an anticipation of the fruitful exercise of the authority being given in that moment. This comes to concrete expression in the words of prayer almost invariably spoken in a public event of ordination, often coinciding with the laying on of hands. In a certain sense, the laying of hands in itself authorizes the candidate. In a sense, the candidate's now ordained. And yet this laying on of hands is accompanied by a prayer. Why? Well, prayer, at least petitionary prayer, which is the sort spoken in the act of ordination, is directed towards the future. There's a request being made. The prayer on behalf of the ordinand recognizes that the faithful and fruitful exercise of authority being given in that moment is still to come. And so the church publicly anticipates this coming faithfulness and fruitfulness by begging God to bring it about. This prayer places hope in God's own confirmation of the church's act of authorization. Therefore, it implicitly recognizes that the church's act of authorizing by the laying on of hands does not, in and of itself, without the further act of God, guarantee a faithful and fruitful exercise of the authority being given. It points forward with humble hope to a coming act of God in and through the ordinand. So in the prayer, the act of ordination is an act of anticipation. So in sum, if we pay close attention just to the ritual of ordination, we can see a threefold grammar of the act of ordination. To ordain is to recognize, to mediate, and to anticipate. Ordination is the recognition of a fitness for authority, thus pointing back to a process of selection and preparation. Ordination is also the mediation of that authority in and with the laying on of hands in that present moment. And ordination is the prayerful anticipation of the divine confirmation and human execution of authority being granted, thus pointing forward to an ongoing state of being authorized. So past, present, future, recognition, mediation, anticipation. In this threefold act, ordination authorizes. Okay, I'm going to take a drink of water, for we have completed the first section. There was water here. I accidentally stole it. Russ! I'm good, Russ. He's a water stealer. Sorry, where is that in the notes? I don't see that. Oh boy. I'm not used to like this. You're all reading along. It's like, I didn't realize that till I got to the second page when I turned the page and you all turned. I'm, oh, that's fun. Anyway, so section 2. What is a theology of ordination? Having analyzed the phenomenon of ordination, we now seek to pierce beneath mere appearances to discern the divine dimension of this human practice. Because it is a human practice, it was fitting to attend to ordination as a phenomenon. And yet, by faith, we recognize that this human practice is divinely ordered. Theology attends to this divine dimension. My hunch is that much of what I said in the first section could be accepted by just, a secular sociologist. I'm just kind of describing what we're doing when we're doing it, right? And now we're moving down to say what by faith do we actually understand to be going on in this phenomenon? So this is neither the time nor the place for a fully fleshed out account of ordination. Instead, I'd like to simply ask, what are the constituent elements of a theology of ordination? What are the basic moves a theology of ordination must make? In other words, what are its central questions? Although I will give only a skeleton, I suspect that such a skeleton will be just as, if not more, useful than a fully fleshed out account. For it will, among other things, be portable enough to recall and flexible enough to apply in various circumstances. So that's the standard I'm hoping to hold myself to. Something portable and flexible that we can use to discuss and apply in all kinds of different circumstances. Thankfully, the basic structure of a theology of ordination is supplied by our phenomenological analysis above. The practice of ordination consists in the church's recognition, mediation, and anticipation of ministerial authority. If the church's faith is to be believed, then the church's act of ordination is preceded, accompanied, and surpassed by a divine act of ordination. The divine act of ordination is an act of divine grace. In the fullness of his grace, God gives. Grace is giving. What does God give in his ordaining act? Well, God gives authority. It is God who authorizes humans to serve as God's ministers. The divine act of ordination is a divine act of grace that consists in the giving of divine authority to a human being so that this human being is authorized to play a special role in God's economy. Thus, it is fitting that the recurring question in the theology of ordination concerns the relationship between divine and human agency, i.e., or that is, the relationship between God's divine act of authorizing individuals for ministry and the church's human act of authorizing individuals, humans for ministry, as well as that individual human in the way that they discern and carry out that authority, right? So there's that divine-human interaction, which gets us right into the heart of theological questions and polemics. Now, the most extreme mistakes render either divine or human agency superfluous. Okay, so like a kind of radical hyper-Calvinism, God's doing all the work, ordination can't even be performed except because God told us to, and we have a Bible verse for it, right? Like, that would be a complete radical divine agency, human agency is irrelevant, okay? And a kind of hyper-Pelagian account would be, all that matters is the human agency, divine agency in some kind of deist way. God sets up the world, but we go and figure out, and we're doing it. It's just us doing stuff, right? So those are like sort of radical extreme forms, right, that we can just kind of ignore. All right, let's talk about the interesting stuff so we can get more complicated in the middle. If we avoid such extremes as most Christian theologies do, most theologies don't actually make those radical mistakes. They're biased one way or the other, but more subtle mistakes are still crouching at the door. For different traditions tend to reduce divine action to just one of the three aspects of ordination outlined above. I'll explain more of this as it unfolds, but I want you to see that, okay? So most traditions say both God and humans are at work in ordination, but they tend to assign the divine part to one of the three and the human part to one of the other three. You know what I'm saying? There's this tendency to kind of split it up and to not see God and humanity at work in each of the three aspects, recognizing, mediating, and anticipating that authority, okay? But just as the church's act of ordination follows a threefold pattern, so also does the divine act of ordination. So we can utilize this structure to remind ourselves and to continue to remind ourselves of the fullness of God's grace. In ordination, the church recognizes, mediates, and anticipates God's grace, recognizes a grace that came before, mediates a grace that is accompanying and anticipates a grace that is still to come and surpasses what we can do. Okay? So first, in ordination, the church recognizes God's grace. When the church recognizes an ordinand's fitness for ordination, we do not merely select from among our own those we surmise to be good at ministry, nor merely respond to those among us who want to do ministry, nor merely oversee the preparation of ordinands for ministry as a human occupation. No, the church, of course, does do all of these things, and there's no shame in saying so, for ordination is a human practice. But that's certainly not all that we are doing. By faith, the church confesses that in its act of ordination, it is first and foremost recognizing a preceding act of divine ordination. In the standard terminology of the Western churches, we refer to this preceding act as a divine calling. And that subordinate clause there in the standard terminology is meant to be a little snarky, like, this is the way we talk about it. I don't think this is actually a good way to use the language of calling, but whatever. It's standard, so I'll use it. But it's me just signaling, by the way, there might be better ways of talking about this, but whatever. Sorry, I don't know why I went off on that, but I told Rich that I cut a lot out, and he's like, oh, did you cut out the snarky stuff? And I'm like, nah, I moved a lot of it to the footnotes. So if you want some snarky side comments, I will supply some extempore as well, but anyway. So as it says in our Wesleyan documents, there are 4 things that ecclesial bodies are to discern in an ordinand: gifts, graces, calling, and fruit. However, anyone who has gone through an ordination process as an ordinand or an ordainer can attest that divine calling is the sine qua non of the church's act of recognition. We look for gifting, we look for graces, we look for fruit, as we should. But even if all those are there, yet we do not discern a calling, ordination gets delayed. I've seen it over and over again. Now, this prioritization of divine calling is likely a function of our pietistic and revivalist roots. We want to know is there's this spiritual event of getting a call, right? Now, I, for one, find this prioritization frustrating, but I resist it only in practice, not in principle. Or should I say only formally, not materially. For we tend to have far too restrictive and prescriptive a notion of the form that a testimony to divine calling might take. Okay? We expect a measure of supernatural clarity and certainty that I think is unfair to expect of others, especially to many of our younger ordinands who just don't articulate their call in the sense of, it was on a Wednesday afternoon and I had this moment, right? Now, I think we should have a much more open mind about what a call story may look like and what many forms it can take. But with that said, I don't think there is a material mistake here. For the church as a human agent does not simply recognize human fitness for authority in its ordinands. No, we confess by faith that we are first and foremost recognizing a divine authorization of a person for ministry. In the standard language of our churches, we recognize a prior divine calling. You all know this who've served on DBDs. Occasionally there's just those people who get terrible grades and they still are just total noobs when it comes to ministry practice, right? But they've got that thing, that spark, that thing, right? We don't even always know how to talk about it. But you just know God has pressed these people into ministry. And we want to hold them accountable and we want to have them, grow into that, but we know there's something there, and we feel compelled to not get in the way entirely, although we might try to slow them down, and I don't know if that's always bad. You track what I'm saying? There's just that sense that there is such a thing as a divine calling. And I think that hunch of ours is not a bad thing. I think we should hold on to that, even if we should be a little more open-minded about the way that could look in lots of different people. So ordination authorizes first because it recognizes. It recognizes a divine summons and empowerment for ordination and authorization to become authorized in the church's ministry. Okay. Second, in an ordination, the church mediates God's grace. In the laying on of hands, the church, through its ministers, symbolically hands on the very authority present in them to the ordinand. This is, by the way, why traditionally only ordained persons are invited to participate in the laying on of hands. Inviting friends and family to join is a sentimental adventure in missing the point. The church hands on authority, and in that moment expands the circle of its authorized persons. But the church does not act alone. No, the church's own act explicitly refers to the work of the divine Spirit in, with, and under the laying on of hands, such that we are not only recognizing a prior divine act of authorization, but in fact mediating a new, fresh, divine act of authorization. This is why in many traditions, ordination is regarded as a sacrament. For, to use the standard definition, sacraments confer the grace that they signify. Not all signs performed by the church also confer the grace that they signify and testify to. All that we do is testifying to, all that we do as a church is signifying grace, right? But only some acts are also handing on, conferring, mediating that grace. This is the standard language, which snarkily implies that I don't know if I buy that way, but it's our standard way of talking about it. Now, ordination, even in traditions that do not officially refer to it as a sacrament, like ours, often follow this very logic, whether we talk this way or not. For we believe by faith that God is not merely present in the initial calling and then steps away, a kind of vocational deism, like God calls you and now you just take over, you know. No, God continues to be involved and is involved centrally and dominantly in this moment of the laying on of hands. God is there doing something fresh. In 1 Timothy 4:14, Paul speaks of the gift given in the laying on of hands by the elders, right? You know, I mean, Paul had selected him, right? Paul had mentored him, right? But something special happens in that laying on that's distinct from the preparation process that leads up to that. Now, our tradition is intertwined with movements that have overreacted to this more sacramental understanding of ordination. So it is easy for us to forget. However, our original historical setting at the time of the Wesleys presupposed and explicitly affirmed this understanding. But we should be careful not to overcorrect our pietist reduction of divine ordination to one's calling by falling into what I'll call sacramentalist reduction of divine ordination to a church ritual. That's also a mistake, to say, okay, all the preparation before, everything after, that's all human, but God shows up in the ordination, and now you have these spooky powers so that you can inhabit this office, right? Kind of ex opere operato, right? A totally exclusively sacramental account of ordination, I think, is a mistake, if it's only that. But we need to also have that in the mix, right? I think both are essential, both the prior act and the concurrent act, recognizing and mediating. Now, third, in ordination, the church anticipates God's grace. The church does not only recognize a prior divine gift and mediate the present divine giving, but also anticipates a forthcoming act of divine gifting. This third aspect of divine ordination is signified by the word of prayer spoken over the ordinand. If the divine act were relegated totally to the past and or the present, then the presentation of the candidate and the laying on of hands would be sufficient. And yet the laying on of hands is always accompanied by a word of prayer. A prayer that typically invokes the Spirit of God, begging God to act yet again, to come afresh on the ordinand, and thereby fully authorizing them for ministry. Again, it would be a mistake to reduce ordination to this anticipatory aspect. In doing so, the church would be shirking its responsibility to properly recognize and mediate the divine gift of ordination. We may tentatively refer to this as a charismatic reduction of divine ordination to divine gifting. It's all about what you're going to do in the future, right? Here the mistake would be to reduce God's act to the surprising and spontaneous, to the marvelous and the miraculous, without respect for the discernment of divine calling and the due administration of divine office. But we ought not to so fear this reductionism that we forget that the giving of gifts for ministry does not end with ordination, but in a crucial sense has only just begun. Ordination is a petition, and so a resolute openness to the forthcoming guidance and gifting and glory of God. Think back to when you were ordained and how bad you were at a couple things that you've actually gotten halfway decent at right now, And do we actually rate to ordain people till they're masters of ministry? I guess we call them, they're masters of divinity, right? But we're still, in a certain important sense, beginners and novices at ordination, right? And that doesn't mean that we just ordinate anybody, right? But it does mean that there is a sense that something's still to come, right? And who really knows what they're getting into when they get ordained, And that's okay. In sum, a theology of ordination asks after the deeper meaning of the human act of ordination in terms of its relation to God's own act. It therefore consists of the threefold question: how does God's own act of ordination precede, accompany, and surpass our human ordaining? Any theology of ordination worthy of the name ought to attend to each of these three aspects and be especially wary of reducing divine agency to just one of them. Okay, time for another water break for me. You could do the same if you'd like. Section 3 is to come. And that was in my manuscript, Bob. Drink here. No. Section 3. It's finally going to be kind of Wesleyan, sort of. Wesleyan-ish, right? We'll see. Now, what makes a theology of ordination Wesleyan? Having analyzed ordination in general, both as a human phenomenon in Section 1 and as a theological reality in Section 2, let us turn to ask what particular perspective Wesleyans have to offer. What is the Wesleyan way of exploring the questions raised above? Here we must continue to be skeletal, not only out of respect for time, but also out of respect for the diversity of Wesleyan theologies of ordination. For the fact is that the Wesleyan tradition has not put forth a discernibly singular theology of ordination. Our answers to these fundamental theological questions tend to be derivative and eclectic. I do not intend these terms as an insult, for most theologies are mostly derivative and eclectic. It may be unfortunate, but it is nothing to be ashamed of, for every Christian tradition has those topics for which they tend to rely on received traditions, more than their own distinctive articulations. For Wesleyan, ordination is one of those topics. And since the received traditions vary widely on these issues, so do we. Nevertheless, Wesleyans do have a distinct way of theologizing about ordination. Namely, we tend to emphasize the complex relationship between ordination and salvation. The Wesleyan tradition is distinctively a soteriologically focused tradition. So even though our positions on the core questions in a theology of ordination tend to be derivative and eclectic, we still have a distinctive and determinate way of exploring these issues. Three stand out to me, each of which correspond roughly to the three aspects of ordination analyzed above. Let me say two things as you turn pages. One is, maybe that was a little too much throat clearing with method, but I think it's important for us to remember there's not necessarily like the Wesleyan view on every theological question, right? Just like there's not the Baptist view on every theological, or the Catholic view on it. Right? There's, like, is there the Wesleyan view on the doctrine of the Trinity? I hope not, right? It's just the doctrine of the Trinity, right? I mean, it's a shared doctrine by many traditions, right? So we tend to have those doctrines that aren't our kind of shtick, right? But that doesn't mean that we have a distinct way of talking about them that comes from those doctrines where we do have a distinct viewpoint, right? So I think it's careful for us to not think there's always like the Wesleyan position on every doctrine, right? We tend to borrow in most of the categories outside soteriology. There is a Wesleyan soteriology. There's debates within it, but there are discernibly Wesleyan soteriologies. And that's, when we talk about the other doctrines, we kind of bump into that, and that's what kind of radiates energy into those other doctrines and helps us kind of think about them. Does that make some kind of sense? Maybe it does. Hope it does. Okay. So first, ordination as recognition raises the question of the logical and even chronological place of ordination in the way of salvation, or via salutis, or ordo salutis, whatever term you prefer. Where does ordination fit in the unfolding of one's salvation? When does ordination occur? Does ordination presuppose true conversion and regeneration? Or may it emerge in and with it, as it did clearly for Paul, right? Who's kind of getting converted and called all in one event, right? Could ordination even somehow precede regeneration, emerging alongside an awakening to sin? I know a lot of people who get called to the ministry and run from God, not just from ministry. Do you know what I mean? And it's like they chase it and they finally get converted and then they come around to doing ministry. You know what I mean? So sometimes even ministry calls seem to come in a weird sequence. Or is it by definition subsequent upon regeneration? Does it even require significant progress in sanctification as a prerequisite, as our denomination used to do more thoroughgoingly? And as we already were debating a little today, even at my table, kind of talking about, how mature of a Christian do you have to be ordained? This is getting at that question theologically. Although Wesleyans tend to take for granted that its ministers will be regenerate and even mature, relatively mature, members of the community, this assumption is not always explicitly warranted, and in fact stands in tension with our consistent sense that ordination is not, in fact, a point on the plot line of the Via Salutis, right? Ordination is not one of the things that everyone goes through. We, like most Christian traditions, affirm the idea of ordination being granted only to some. Whereas the Via Salutis applies to all Christians, everyone passes from awakening to justification to sanctification. This is the structure of the Christian life in general. Ordination does not. Ordination doesn't apply. It's kind of not on the plot line. Therefore, the event of ordination, by its very nature, cannot be plotted on the Via Salutis as such. And so we run into recurring questions. How far along must a Christian be in order to be ordained? Again, I think Wesleyans have offered a diversity of answers on this question. And I imagine that in this room, we likely have a diversity of opinion on this question. A diversity that I have no interest in foreclosing anytime soon, and certainly not today. Mostly because I don't have an opinion yet, not because I'm that nice of a person, but no, I also want to keep it open. But it seems to me that it is, in fact, distinctively Wesleyan to think long and hard about this question, right? Us debating that is a Wesleyan act. We are not a tradition that simply checks to make sure that our ordinands are members in good standing, or that they're good at the job, right? Or that they have gone through the proper ritual, right? We want to know. Such a purely empirical judgment is odious to us, precisely as Wesleyans. As Wesleyans, we are deeply inclined to wonder about the unfolding progress of the souls of all Christians. We are deeply concerned about a real and not merely nominal Christianity. And so this concern fittingly applies to the church's work of recognizing whom God has authorized for ministry. We ought to be careful to not set too high a bar for ordination, and that is our natural temptation as perfectionist tradition. But we ought not overcorrect by having no bar at all, which is also our temptation as pragmatic, kind of entrepreneurial kinds of mission-oriented community. We tend to just whipsaw back and forth. It's all about how high the bar is. Some people want it high, some people want it low. Expecting our pastors to already be perfect is pernicious. But expecting our pastors to be pursuing perfection is prudent. Not that I have already attained, but I strive on toward the goal. Second, in what sense is the mediating act of ordination a means of grace? Though not all, or even many Wesleyans explicitly regard ordination as a sacrament, our expansive and inclusive notion of a means of grace exerts an influence on our thinking about the act of laying on of hands. In the laying on of hands, the church mediates a present divine act of ordination. Now, in Wesleyan sacramentology in general, and a Wesleyan theology of ministry in particular, there is considerable ambiguity and even controversy regarding the precise relationship between divine and human agency in ritualized ecclesial actions. That was a kind of convoluted way of saying we don't agree about sacramentology, right? I mean, like, we got high church, low church all over the place in Wesleyan tradition. It seems to me that this ambiguity need not be settled for us to articulate a distinctive Wesleyan account. In fact, it may be part of the Wesleyan way that it finds this question relevant but not decisive. Part of being Wesleyan is actually being able to handle that very ambiguity. We don't need to sort that out in order to be Wesleyan. Rather, it seems to me that our much looser language of the means of grace being a looser, inclusive canon of sacramental or even sacramentish practices, sets the terms for our central concerns surrounding ordination. We would be wise to consider how and in what sense ordination serves, if not as a sacrament, at least as a means of grace for all those who participate. Perhaps you may indulge a bit of personal testimony on this front. For me, at least, receiving the laying on of hands was a sort of converting ordinance for me. Not converting in the sense of the first time. I was already at least a little converted, I hope. But in the sense of the ongoing conversion that is the Christian life. I had struggled deeply with my place in the church and in the ministry, especially as it related to my intellectual interests and my emerging vocation to teach. Should I get ordained? Should I not? Really, and all kind of playing out of who am I and do I really belong here? Standard late adolescent stuff, right? But it was very real for me, right? For me, the laying on of hands brought with it the recognition and affirmation by the church that was so important to me and something that I had sought for so long. It granted me a clear sense that the Spirit was being placed upon me, not only as an inner teacher, but as one who is authorizing me as a lifelong student and teacher of divine things. Coming forward and kneeling at that altar, receiving the Spirit afresh through the laying on of hands of the ministers in my district, including the laying of the hand upon my head by our general superintendent, that for me may have been the most important altar call of my life. One to which I remember and come back to again and again, and most of all, when I get to participate as one of those hands being laid on another. Like the reaffirmation of vows that implicitly occurs whenever I attend a wedding with my wife, or the reaffirmation of my baptism whenever I witness another being baptized. Just like that, every ordination service continues to be a means of grace for me, confirming and deepening and summoning me in my life of service. If you can't tell, I just love ordination services. Like, I really love them. Even when they're terrible, I just love them because there's something about it. It reconnects me with this altar call that was so crucial for me. Now, perhaps this experience is unique to me, but I have good reason to believe that I'm not alone in this. Perhaps more explicit attention and consideration of ordination as a means of grace would enrich the experience, or at the very least set our standards a little higher than merely getting it over with at district conference so that we can get on to other matters of business. Ordination is not mere business. It is a means of grace. And I didn't write this in here, but I wonder if there's logistical issues here. Don't get me wrong. But do we want to at least maybe even experiment with ordination service on a Sunday morning with the people there that they will be ministering to? I mean, I've been to a lot of friends in churches that do it that way. And and there's huge downsides, but there's something about it, because it's a means of grace that blesses anyone in the room. Again, that's not a proposal. It's a suggestion for consideration. At the bottom, the thing that I care about is the part that someone said amen to. I should have stopped. When someone says amen, you should shut up, right? It's like, ooh, that was a good line. Apparently I should have. Yeah, ordination is not mere business. It's a means of grace. Now, third and finally, the anticipatory aspect of ordination links it with the Wesleyan distinctive doctrine of entire sanctification. Ordination, by its very nature, is ordered to its future. What is that future? Well, ordination authorizes by anticipating an ongoing life of service, no mere status, but an ongoing journey into communion with God and with others in that communion. This is especially crucial when navigating the persistent question of what, if any, practices are reserved for the ordained alone. This has come up a lot this weekend. From its inception, the Wesleyan tradition has been of two minds on this matter. On the one hand, we have carried on, for the most part, the tradition of reserving Eucharistic presidency as the exclusive right and responsibility of ordained ministers. On the other hand, our entire movement is animated by a democratized proclamation, from Wesley's lay leaders to holy rolling testifiers. Ironically, early Methodist circuit riders embody both sides of this tension. You've got local lay people doing a lot of preaching and leading, and yet the ordained pastor needs to be the one who leads communion when they come into town, right? So you get that tension. Even sometimes we can affirm both of these somehow at the same time. And Wesley himself, in a late sermon called Prophets and Priests, basically articulates this tension, right? So the tension's right there in our tradition. Now, I am not interested in resolving this tension today. Rather, I want to call attention to the fact of this unresolved tension and ponder whether it makes a certain sort of sense given our soteriological convictions. What I want to suggest is that entire sanctification just is the fulfillment of ordination. That ordination, like justification, is ordered toward perfect love. That entire sanctification, that Christ-likeness, that true love of God and of neighbor just is the end to which ordination is directed. I want to suggest that ordination is not primarily about certain people getting to do certain things that only those certain people get to do. It might be that, but it's not primarily that. Not its primary point. Perhaps the point or function or purpose of ordination, in keeping with our deepest Wesleyan wisdom, is as just another particular act provided by God to bring us closer to Him. As an act of anticipation, ordination is a human act by which we wait for God to act. And so its primary significance lies not in its authorization to do this or that, but it's in its authorization to pursue God entirely, to surrender one's whole life to God's service. Perhaps ordination is less about performing and more about perfecting. And therewith comes less about performing a service for others, but being perfected in a life-giving way. That is what we're all called to. If so, then ordination matters, even if a strong distinction between clergy and laity does not. I think a lot of us get trapped into thinking, well, we got to have this strong clergy-lay distinction or ordination won't matter. And I'm just not convinced that they're correlated. I was just talking with someone at lunch break, and they were saying, we don't need to be threatened by the raising of the laity's capacity for ministry. An empowered laity is an empowered ministry, precisely as the leaders and authorizers of that ministry. And I think that instinct's right. Ordination may very well be a means of grace to which some are invited on their way towards the perfection to which all are called. Track that? All Christians are called to perfection. Some of us can't get there without getting ordained. Okay? Implicitly meaning that the clergy are, in a certain sense, more impoverished. We need an extra step on our particular via salutis, right? And you see an analogy for this in marriage, right? Which, whether you call it a sacrament or not, functions as a means of grace, a grace to which many of us resist, even in marriage, right? But there's an opportunity there for transformation. And those of us who've been, married for a little while, it's almost inconceivable our salvation life without our partner. That's been such a site of sanctifying grace for us. But that you can say that without implying that you have to get married to get close to God, right? I mean, that would be silly. And sometimes we actually imply that. We shouldn't do that, right? But some of us need certain acts to move on this journey that we're being drawn on. To be perfected in love is to be released from the excessive orientation to one's self-improvement, and hence released for life-giving service in the world. This is precisely the sort of reorientation that ordination anticipates. The more one matures into this perfect love, the more one's ordination status becomes a distinction without a difference, right? I'm trying to get at, the point is, an entirely sanctified layperson and an entirely sanctified pastor, it should be the distinction becomes uninteresting at that point, right? Because the life is being lived so much in service of life-giving to the world that it actually has a kind of identical structure, right? Even though it matters on the way there and it matters in terms of functional authority. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter, right? But what matters most is this growth into love for the world. Okay, where am I? Too many side comments. Now, if along the way the line between ordained and non-ordained gets a little fuzzy, that needn't worry us over much. Maybe it does you, but it doesn't worry me. Ordination will still matter. For some of us have discerned that we cannot do what God has authorized to do without the church recognizing, mediating, and anticipating that authority. But in the end, actually exercising that authority matters way more than any letters before our name. And the exercise of divine authority rests ultimately on participating in divine love. In the end, the only authority any of us has is the love of God. Thank you. I stay, go? Oh, right.
Thank you so much, John, for delivering a paper that makes one think and kind of convicts us, at least me. It's a rare combination, I think, in a paper like that. Thank you. And Rich Eckley from Houghton College has agreed to listen deeply and respond fruitfully to John's paper. So, Rich.
Yeah, people were talking about timing of these things, and that was a pretty good paper for the last one, wasn't it? And hopefully our minds are still able to take this in. I've read this twice now and heard it, and I have some things I've written, but I think I'll step away from it for a little bit because in some ways some of my ideas over the last week I've heard in this room in the last day or so, and I don't want to be just a talking head. I really do want to respond in a kind of reflective way to what I just heard. Professor Drury has given us a skeleton, a structure for thinking about ordination, and perhaps giving us a way forward in developing a theology of the ordained ministry. Eventually, that intrinsic structure gave way to a threefold image that carries us through the act or ritual of ordination to recognize, to mediate, and to anticipate an authorization to minister, even in the Wesleyan tradition. I suppose there might be two approaches toward developing any theology or of ordination. One would be a movement from abstract to concrete. This classical approach, often taken in ecumenical dialogue, where one attempts to define clear, rational arguments and move all bodies towards that end, that's quite often taken up. I think of the BEM document in the World Council of Churches. A document should be right in the center of what we're doing right now. I think it's a beautiful text, attempting to get at some kind of agreed upon idea about baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. It's also, I think, found in our discipline. Historically, we've taken this approach where we describe a kind of perfect description of what we want, and we may even call it the preferred means, okay? And then we notice that very few people in the church actually do that. So we may secondarily then take an approach that starts with the present reality, a theology from below, which is rooted in the experience of the church, congregations, diverse ministries that we see happening today. This approach is often supplemented by good sociological analysis and practical practice. I picture this paper as attempting to bridge these models in a very creative and helpful way. By limiting his scope to a theology of ordination, he was able to discern a certain grammar within the act and process of ordination without muddying the waters with words like ministry, office, ordo, or if you notice, he never really veered off into leadership, okay? How could you talk about ordination and not talk about leadership? In some respects, this would be the flesh that he alludes to and definitely avoids. I'm going to put a little flesh on his skeleton, and I think you've been doing it, and hopefully, I think this is what Dave thought I might be able to do, is build a bridge to conversation. And you're probably already thinking, and I know this is what John wanted you to do, he's giving you a certain structure, some certain words and ideas that you should overlay some of the topics that we've been hearing over the last day. I just have the chance to do this before you. And it gave, when I was reading the paper, it gave rise to some tensions that the paper itself created in me. And I thought, well, these are some of the fleshly features I'll put on the skeleton. And one of the first that came forward for me was a distinction between Christological and pneumatological features of ordination. Dr. Drury was right to point to a Wesleyan emphasis on pneumatology. It popped up a couple of places in the paper. As he said, there is an inherent role of the Spirit in sanctification and in the church's empowerment to become one, holy, and Catholic. Even the prayer that Professor Drury points to in the ordination ritual, often called the epiclesis, is a call to the Holy Spirit to come upon the ordinand, which he described as something he experienced himself. But since medieval times, the Western Church often fell into the danger of what we call Christomonism, okay? And Christomonism is obviously a description of the work of the church without this pneumatological dimension brought to bear upon it. And it created problems in the office of the ordained ministry. And I would just give one example from canon law, one of which we can all be thankful that we don't fall into this danger. But if you become so centralized in thinking about the structures of the church as having come from Christ alone, okay, then those structures looked very incarnationally connected to the historic Jesus. In canon law, this is the very argument as to why a priest must be a man, okay? Jesus was a man, simple, okay? If the church is to build its ministries based on Christ, then it will look like the apostles, it will look like him, etc. We're a tradition, a Pentecostal tradition, that makes the case that the Holy Spirit gives birth to newness. Sons and daughters are finding the Spirit poured on them. They prophesy, and it's a whole new world, a whole new day. So again, we don't seem to have this problem of Christomonism. It was only through the lens of Christ in this model that the apostolic head of the church and the risen Lord that ordained ministry was defined. Our tradition, as it has practiced it, has elevated the role of the Holy Spirit into a new and present act of the risen Christ through his Spirit, building up the church here and now. I tend to agree, this is a long quote from John's paper, but just to point, this was one that I stayed on for a little bit. I tend to agree with this comment that he made, that to be perfected in love is to be released from the excessive orientation to one's self-improvement and hence released for life-giving service to the world. This is precisely the sort of reorientation that ordination anticipates. The more one matures into this perfect love, the more one's ordination status becomes a distinction without difference. You might remember this quote, okay? And if along the way, the line between the ordained and the non-ordained gets a little fuzzy, that needn't worry us over much. Well, I read that and I thought, well, at the same time, we must balance Christology with pneumatology, okay? I do think pneumatology has a tendency to make things fuzzy, okay? So John wanted a Congar quote, and I would just say Congar's famous quote, that there is no Christology without pneumatology, and no pneumatology without Christology. Certainly is a tension found in the ordained ministry. Being fuzzy makes sense as we all become absorbed into the body of Christ through such selfless acts of love, but the continued concern of the church for fidelity to the sent mission of Jesus Christ is to be held with rare care. And here's a snarky comment. I actually put into my search on his paper the word Jesus, like a Sunday school student, and it never showed up in his paper. I don't know what that means, but I will just... A second tension that I would put the flesh on the skeleton has to do with something, again, that we've been talking about for the last 2 days. The distinction between what some have called baptismal ministry and ordained ministry. And I like the sacramental pieces that he was describing, because I was thinking at the same time when he mentioned that lay people, or people, ordained people in the church watching someone become ordained, that there's something about almost like being a married couple watching someone else being married, that it's a renewal of your vows, it's a renewal of grace in your life. But I also thought that also applies to lay people watching ordained clergy being ordained, that in a way we're doing it on their behalf. And again, I'm sounding like I'm waffling here, because I am, that John's point that the distinction between baptismal ministry and ordained ministry may be that fuzzy, that lay people can take pride, do they not, when they see their pastor be ordained, or that they see children that they have grown up in their church go off to be ordained and to ordained ministry, that in a way they see it as themselves. You know, the church I come from, there's not a lot to be taking pride in me, but when I go home, I'm like a king. They think I'm the greatest guy they've... Oh, we remember when you were... Yeah, you know what I mean. You've probably had that experience too. So I'm not necessarily making a case for a kind of dualistic, even hierarchical vision of the economy of the church, but I would see nothing in his threefold pattern that does not exist in the call to the church, to all its members to be ministers. They would go through the same experience. I was thinking of confirmation. That confirmation is that place where baptized people are asking again, what are my gifts? What does God want me to do with my life? Much like what we're being asked in this phenomenological description that John just gave us. A third tension, and this is my last, and then you'll get a chance to say stuff. the distinction between the ontological and the functional features of the ordained ministry. Under this heading would be the question of what one is ordained for, or what is referred to as an office. Districts tend to make these decisions, or by submitting the discernment of minister status as ordainable by whether or not one can do ministry. The fact of the matter, there are many people who can do ministry. In the past, we called lay people who could preach lay preachers, or people who could do pastoral care lay leaders or lay pastors. It would appear that we are much more willing to offer such persons ordained status to acknowledge that the work they're doing is ministry. And I have a little sidebar here myself here. I was just saying something about this chart that we saw yesterday with the three various categories. I know that obviously the context for this must be coming from our mega churches, our large churches, that tend to be creating their own ordained ministers, okay? And I find this to be a strange invention in our church, that we are creating a kind of inner congregational model inside of a denominational system. Many of these leaders of these churches have even made comments like that they don't know what value the denomination has for them, okay? And it's obvious when they want to ordain their own clergy that they are creating their own matrix of authority. I find that to be a strange distinction between, in this ontological functional tension, if it's just that we're ordaining people because they can do something, then ordination really has no meaning, okay? It is this deeper dimension that John is pointing to. It's almost a nuanced mystery. It's why it's so hard to define in this room, okay? That it's that thing that stops us from being ordained, even though we have all of the skill sets that could cause us to be ministers. Well, that's kind of where I'm going to finish. I have some nice things to say, and I basically probably should end by saying that. I thought his paper was a gift of clarity. He has a gift for this. I think, John, this charism, you ought to find a place where you can do that because he has a gift for doing theology. Thank you.
Thank you.